Raiding in Classic World of Warcraft so far has been, for the most part, fairly straightforward. Especially among top players, it's a totally different game from retail WoW. The Race to World First is a huge event for dozens of players, putting in hundreds of pulls on some of the most tightly tuned bosses Blizzard has recently cooked up. For us over in Classic, it's more of a surprise if the bosses make it past the first hour, never mind the first reset. And despite the chasm between the two, there will always be the player who wants to go the extra mile, get every ounce of performance possible out of their class, and be, as they would say, a Giga Chad pumper. Today I want to cover the most interesting ways players have taken advantage of in-game mechanics, stacked buffs, and found new ways to interact with items and so on in order to get that extra bit of performance out of their character. There is a lot of variation from different methods in terms of putting a number on what the actual DPS benefit would be. For some it's a tiny difference, for others it's upwards of 30% easily. And you know what a key part of min-maxing your DPS has always been? Food buffs. And that goes for real life as well as in-game. HelloFresh is America's #1 meal prep kit, and this month they've given me an amazing code that can get you 65% off. No more meal planning, time-consuming grocery trips, and hoping that you bought that something the last occasion you went shopping. HelloFresh delivers everything you need to make delicious, wholesome meals straight to your door. HelloFresh gives you the tools to make amazing food without the leftover spares you don't know what to do with, allowing you to cut down on wasting food, time, and money. With everything packaged up ready to go along with set menus, time in the kitchen is cut down considerably, with most meals being ready in 30 minutes or less. And with foolproof step-by-step recipes, you can sort out your real-life cooking daily in a stress-free and fun way. Use my link or go to hellofresh.com and use code POGWillie65 for 65% off, plus free shipping on your first box. And once you click the link, my description will live update to count up the purchases. Many thanks to HelloFresh for the sponsor on the video. Let's talk WoW. Right then, we have to start somewhere, and it's gonna be Feral Druids. There's something about this spec which attracts people who are just built different. From day one of Classic, there's always been some weird way to optimize performance of this particular class and spec. In fact, this is more or less the Feral Druid part of the video. They have the most class-specific optimizations that I can think of. Now, Feral Druids, despite equipping weapons, don't actually attack with those weapons. They're clawing away as a cat or mauling as a bear, and that meant in Classic and TBC your weapon was more or less a stat stick, as melee weapons are to hunters. Also, you couldn't proc some of the BIS enchants like Crusader or Mongoose and had to use agility instead. These all seem like very negative things, but it gave rise to a level 29 weapon from Gnomeregan becoming the best item you could equip for the entire expansion. Yes, throughout all of Classic there was nothing better. It was replaced in TBC eventually due to raw stats outpacing it, but in Classic as a feral, if you really wanted to perform, you had to go and farm manual crowd pummelers. This was about a 1 in 3 drop from an optional boss in Noma called Crowd Pummeler 960, who you can get to in a few minutes from the back door of the instance. What makes it so good is the on-use effect. Since your weapon is just raw stats, the fact you could add 50% attack speed for 30 seconds was a buff that nothing else in the game could match. Meaning to really push performance, you kinda had to go and farm these. And oh boy, did you have to farm a lot of them. You see the tooltip where it says 3 charges? Each 1 in 3 drop from a level 29 boss gave you 90 seconds of God mode, and then you needed to go farm another and another and another. Oh, and dungeons would lock you out after 5 resets within 1 hour. Goes without saying, but a reset took less than 12 minutes. This was best in slot for Bear and Cat, by the way. Both benefited hugely from the increased attack speed. Out of everything we go over today, this would have probably been the most time consuming to do, and it didn't make you top DPS either, like not even remotely close to what warriors were capable of doing. But that is not all Cats had to do. In addition to your level 29 weapon, you also had a level 40 helm that was BIS forever, the Wolf Head's Helm. This was used for the majority of TBC as well, though I believe at some point raw stats on items did overtake it. Wolf's Head Helm was used to perform something called power shifting. Now, back in Classic and TBC, energy regenerated at at a rate of 20 per 2 seconds, not as a constant bar filling up like it's in Wrath and, well, every single expansion beyond that. And as you can see on this helmet, it grants 20 energy when shifting into Cat. Over in the talent tree, what if we combine this with the Fura talent, which gave a further 40 energy when entering Cat form? Well, that's 60 energy for leaving and re-entering Cat. If you time this correctly with the energy tick, that would give you a further 20, and you went from near an empty energy bar to a nearly full one in the matter of about 1 second. This technique simply gave you more energy to use on Shred than you could possibly achieve just waiting for your bar to fill up normally. It was, however, very mana intensive to maintain, meaning druids went through many more mana potions and dark rune than your average DPS would. And no, it still didn't make you top DPS either. But wait, there's more on feral druids. After having spent many nights in Gnomeregan farming weapons and wearing a level 40 helm in TBC, Blizzard had one more curveball for you. In patch 2.2, changes were made to regeneration effects in World of Warcraft to try and make them more consistent across the board. Under the old tick-based system, sometimes using a spell on the moment when the tick occurred would cause you to partially use the benefit of some of that spell, such as Innovate or Evocation not actually giving their full duration. A change was made so instead of the tick happening globally, it now happened on a player-by-player basis, and also very importantly, any change a player made to their personal tick timer would reset it, as well as then refunding any resources that would have been lost due to the change in the timer. Okay, you still with me here? So essentially, instead of you being able to power shift, gaining 20 energy from your Wolf's Head helm, 40 from Fura, and then another 20 a moment later from the global tick, it was now the case where you were shifting into Cat. That was a change in your energy regeneration and the timer reset, meaning you were sitting there for about a full 2 seconds waiting for your energy tick. This made your rotation much slower than it used to be. Enter Weak Troll's Blood Potion. This level 8 consumable gave you a minor amount of health regen. Using and cancelling this effect at the start of a power shift would make the game consider a change in your regeneration rate, and would therefore restore some resources which have been lost in the change, such as energy. So druids would have to shift into Cat form, drink a Weak Troll's Blood Potion, cancel the buff within about a 0.5 second window by the way, cast Shred, the energy tick happens, cast second Shred, and then power shift again and chug another potion. This means that druids were going through one potion every 4 seconds in order to match what power shifting was able to do previously. Or if we take a 3-minute fight as an example, a feral druid would go through 45 potions. And this was just to be back in middle of the pack DPS, by the way. It's been a roller coaster for feral mains, I'll say that much. Enough about druids though, because I have loads of other things I want to cover. Because you can't talk about min-maxing buffs without at least giving a throwback to world buffs in Classic. We're going to go all the way from the fairly easy ones to the I don't know how people put up with these ones. Spirit of Zandalar I would say was the easiest to get by far. You go and hand in the Heart of Hakara at Yojamba Isle, and about 30 seconds later the Spirit of Zandalar buff goes out for every player on the isle as well as in Booty Bay, and you can see it gives a pretty huge chunk of stats, though definitely much better for physical classes. Best of all, there was no cooldown on handing this in bar a short bit of roleplay, and it was undispellable, nice and easy. And at one point, somehow, someway, the Spirit of Zandalar buff was added to the player's spellbook with no global cooldown. You could literally run around spamming the buff for others and it would grant it to everyone in your zone. It was pretty hilarious, unintended, and of course it got fixed. Next, Rallying Cry of the Dragon Slayer. It was layer specific. This got changed to across all layers later on in Classic. But for a lot of Classic, you had to be on the correct layer for the buff. This buff was given out after handing in the Head of Nefarian or Onyxia in Stormwind or Orgrimmar. This conferred a huge buff to all players in the affected area, whatever level they were. Yes, you could get this on a level 1. Yes, it made leveling insane. Now, the problem was, apart from having to be on the correct layer, was that the quest hand-in had a 6-hour cooldown independent of each hand-in. And sometimes as a guild you want to buff, but hey, it's still on a 4-hour cooldown. That's a problem. What do we do about that? Well, you had to reset the quest NPC. This meant getting a member, usually a priest of the opposing faction, to come and mind control the quest NPC so you can then take them out, because when they respawn in a few minutes you could do another hand-in. Unless you had that one guy that kept killing the mind controller and stopping literally hundreds of people from getting the buff, which definitely happened by the way. Now we have the Diamore North buffs, or more commonly known as the tribute buffs. So this was a little more complicated to get. A tribute run is completing Diamore North whilst keeping many of the bosses alive. At the end of the run, when you defeat King Gordok, you're declared the new King of Diamore, and you can run back through the instance and talk to the bosses which you left alive for their tribute. And for most of the bosses, this tribute was a buff that you can see on the screen here. Yes, all of these stack too, by the way. Now, this is where the problems begin. See, clearing Diamore North takes time, and if you have your other world buffs running already, you just, well, don't have time to do that. Fortunately, however, hunters would commonly clear Diamore North solo as a gold farm, and then they could sell the cleared ID to somebody else. But you still had to get to Diamore, which is in the absolute middle of nowhere. So people would buy summons to get to the instance. Players would have several accounts with summoning networks set up to get people inside the instance, sometimes inside the actual instance portal, to mitigate the risk of getting ganked. Oh, and just to mention it as well, Diamore North buffs are magical, so they can be dispelled, meaning now you don't have to worry about dying and losing buffs. Now it's any priest, shaman, or any other magical dispel can remove your efforts. And we aren't done yet. In fact, we're very far from done. Next, you need another summon to get to Felwood for your Songflower buff. So this buff comes as part of a quest chain in Felwood, where eventually you can cleanse several of the plants around the zones for buffs such as food, or in this case, a whole bunch of crit and stats. Now, each plant had an individual 25-minute cooldown, depending on layer of course, and any person who used it would start that cooldown. However, I'm not sure whether it was thanks to our good friend spell batching or if everybody just spammed it at the same time, but if everyone clicked it the moment it came up, everybody would be able to pick up the buff around it. Oh, but in case you thought this was getting too easy, this buff only lasts 1 hour and it's magic dispellable. Gotta be careful. Our next step can be the easiest or by far the most difficult. We need to go to the Darkmoon Fair. This event is only available once per month for 1 week, rotating between Elwyn Forest outside Stormwind or Morgor outside of Thunder Bluff. Of course, even on PvP servers, both of these zones are not contested, meaning as an Alliance player in Elwyn, I can very safely stroll out of Stormwind and pick up my buff, no problem. Oh, and by the way, the buff is just 10% more flat damage after you pick some certain options from Soothsayer Sage, so it's pretty massive. The hard part comes in when you have to go to the other factions fair, because they know people will be coming to the zone and they are going to be force flanked on PvP servers, whilst they will not be, meaning people would actively defend the buff from the opposing faction. Creative workarounds such as invisibility potions and having someone in your group join a battleground were used to make picking up this buff consistent, as when your battleground queue pops, you can use a weak aura to instantly accept the correct options from Sage, then join the battleground and leave, and you'll be ported to wherever that person joined the battleground from. So all in all, it was very much doable. And we aren't done yet either. The final buff we need to pick up was relatively easy for the Horde and nightmare fuel for the Alliance. However, I will say it's essentially a melee only buff, which made me happy that I chose Warlock because I did not have to deal with picking this up personally. I'm of course talking about Warchief's Blessing. The bit you care about on this buff is the 15% melee haste for 1 hour, which is an absolute enormous amount. Okay, so prepare yourself for what we need to do to pick this one up. On Horde, there is a quest to kill Rend Blackhand in Upper Black Rock Spire as part of their Onyxia attunement called For the Horde, i.e. you can only do this once per character, meaning you have to try and actively monitor players around the appropriate level and whisper them asking if they're going to be handing in. I remember getting whispers on my shaman anytime I went near Thrall. After you hand in, a mere 8 seconds later the buff will drop in Orgrimmar, and about 17 seconds later will also drop in the Crossroads. The roleplay on many of the other hand-ins gave you plenty of time, a good 30 seconds or so to get logged in whenever the buff was called, but with Warchief's Blessing you kinda already had to be logged in and waiting. And at this point in time, since it's a 1 hour buff, you're going to have other buffs running too, so you don't want to be logged in for too long either. Also, the buff going out has a 3 hour cooldown and you can't reset it because, well, it's Thrall himself who gives out the buff. You can't exactly walk into Orgrimmar and mind control a Warchief. Now, the thing about this buff is it was faction specific. Only Horde players can get it. Or can they? What if Alliance players did a little bit of changing of factions at the moment when the buff was granted? Well, in fact, they could. Back in Classic, when you got mind controlled by a member of the opposing faction, you would change to their faction for its duration. This was changed in TBC at some point. Now, if you've been following what I've been going on about, you'll notice that Warchief's Blessing only drops in Orgrimmar or the Crossroads, which as an Alliance player aren't exactly places which you want to be, meaning you would have to get summoned somewhere that often used creative game mechanics to get to. After getting summoned, you find out in Discord when the buff drops. You don't want to be logged in too early, but after you log in, you need to then get mind controlled, get the buff, drop the mind control, and then port out to Stormwind and hide somewhere because you'll be flagged for PvP and you still could get dispelled. And now you're ready to raid. It's just that easy. Oh, and keep in mind with all these buffs, you can easily hit the buff cap. Yes, there is a buff cap, by the way, which is 32. This meant, for example, using heals over time on a druid was quite literally griefing your raid because a rejuvenation could knock off Rallying Cry of the Dragon Slayer, leading to a very angry DPS player. But I think you get the idea with world buffs. They were certainly something. Actually, there were a couple more buffs you could get if you really wanted to go all out. In fact, there were a lot more than this. I'll cover a couple of the more interesting ones though. You'll probably remember Diamond Flask. This was a really unique trinket that only warriors could get as part of their class questline. It gave a bunch of strength as well as a small amount of healing over its duration. Now, there were two things on this quest which may not be immediately obvious. First of all, if you didn't pick this item as a quest reward, ouch, that is all I can say, because for some unknown reason the healing it granted scaled with the amount of bonus healing power that the warrior had equipped at the time on a 1-to-1 ratio, and it snapshotted that value. This means warriors would actually have a full-on bonus healing set with enchanted weapons, trinkets and everything else. I've heard of warriors outbidding healers for rejuvenating gem in GDKPs before for their healing set. They put on their healing set, use their diamond flask, then swap to their real gear and are healing a ton throughout the fight passively. This was genuinely a very good thing to do for very obvious reasons in PvP and certain fights where you took regular damage such as Sapphiron, Veilstraz, Viscidus or even Lotheb where the heal kept you topped off made this an incredibly powerful trinket. And the fact that it snapshotted healing whatsoever was just frankly bizarre. In patch notes from vanilla in 1.7, that's the ZG patch, it says all item based self heals will no longer be affected by equipment that provides bonuses to healing, and they give examples of Arcanite Champion and Crusader enchants. So fun detected, fun left alone, I suppose. But that's not all you got from this quest, because upon actually handing in at the NPC, he would cast an AoE mega battle shout which affected all nearby units. This lasted a short 15 minutes and was a bonus 400 attack power, which didn't stack with regular battle shout, but it was worth getting if you were going all out. Next one is definitely one of the more obscure ones, and I wonder how many of you guys will remember this. This was an alliance only buff, which of course meant it got nerfed very quickly. Okay, for real though, this would have been the most powerful world buff to ever exist and would have led to some truly insane boss clear times. It was part of the Alliance Onyxia attunement during the jailbreak part of the quest. NPC Marshal Windsor would have a buff called Windsor's Frenzy, which gave 65% attack speed to all nearby friendly units. That is more than double heroism. However, it was supposed to be just an aura for Windsor himself and nearby allies, but for a time it was actually buffing nearby allies instead, so Alliance players had access to a 65% attack speed buff, though it only did last for 10 minutes. It would have allowed for passes like nothing else we've ever seen before, but hey, it didn't last. Soon after, it was patched to work correctly and just buff units near Windsor instead of buffing players, so not too much was ever done with it. One final buff from Classic that was available as part of the Scourge invasion, again stacked with every other buff in the game because why not? Actually, this buff was used for many of the fastest clears of Nax 25 in Wrath of the Lich King Classic because, yeah, everyone kind of forgot about it existing and it still worked in raids. Whoops. It's been nerfed now, by the way. Anyways, Soul Revival is given out in the area nearby after a damaged necrotic shard is destroyed by defeating the nearby Scourge. It takes a while to deplete all of its health, but when it does, it's a huge 10% further boost to your damage, but it only lasts for 30 minutes, so you do have to make the most of it as soon as possible. Now, you'll probably notice that well, everything so far has been from Classic, as in Vanilla Classic, because it was completely degenerate when it came to doing this kind of min-maxing. But there was one discovery made during the Burning Crusade which I distinctly remember, because I used it in raids on my Paladin, and that was Battle Chicken stacking. Okay, so Gnomish Battle Chicken needs 230 engineering to make. It's a 20-minute cooldown trinket that summons a chicken to assist you in combat. Doesn't really do all that much damage or anything, but when it's in combat it has a chance to proc Battle Squawk, giving 5% melee haste for 4 minutes. Now this trinket had been around since Classic, but it was too high RNG on getting the proc to happen, and it was too short duration to make the most out of it. Or was it? Midway through the Burning Crusade, a way to force proc Battle Squawk was discovered. It turns out if your character receives any hostile action and then you pop the trinket, it would consistently send out the buff a few seconds later. Hostile action meaning anything from an enemy, it doesn't matter if you dodge or resist. As long as something happens to your character, the buff should then go out. Best of all, this buff stacked with your group. You could have 4 minutes of 25% extra melee haste. That's only 5% less than heroism for an entire 4 minutes, which was more than the duration of many boss fights in TBC. And you could swap out the trinket after the buff went out. It didn't even disappear, making this a huge DPS gain. Players would begin to figure out safe ways to proc chickens before fights started, such as keeping one NPC alive which AoEs, or taunting the water elementals in front of Hydros, to name 2. Either way, in a later patch, Blizzard accidentally fixed this interaction. Here's what they had to say about it. With restarts this week, we deployed a hotfix for a bug where Illidan was not respecting the initial cooldown on some of his abilities, such as his phase 5 Enrage. A knock-on effect from this fix is that Battle Squawk from the Gnomish Battle Chicken can no longer bypass its initial cooldown period as it could pre 2.1 WoW. Battle Squawk now observes its correct initial cooldown rules as it did starting in patch 2.1. It was probably for the best that it happened, though it would have made for some new and interesting tactics in the Sunwell on how to best proc your chicken. And those are all the various things I wanted to cover today. There's actually a bunch more different ways which players use to get a competitive edge. Maybe I can do a follow-up on this video. Put a comment down below with anything else you took advantage of and that you'd like me to talk about. And if you like the video, drop a like too. It helps me know you want more of this kind of stuff. That's everything though. As always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon.